Hi everyone, I'm Lucy, and today I have something really interesting for you. We're going to listen to a conversation about something you use every day but might not think much about: temperature. You'll hear about Celsius and Fahrenheit, the two different ways to measure it. And trust me, once you understand the difference, you'll be able to talk about weather like a pro. Pay close attention, because you might learn a few surprising things.
Dad, today my teacher mentioned something about temperatures being measured in Celsius and Fahrenheit. I don't really understand the difference. Can you explain it to me?
Of course, Mia, that's a really great question. So, temperatures around the world are mostly measured in Celsius, but here in the US, we still use Fahrenheit. It's like how we use miles instead of kilometers. Do you know much about Celsius?
Hmm. I think I've heard that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and boils at 100 degrees, right?
You got it. That's the simple way to think of Celsius. Water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and boils at 100 degrees Celsius. It's all based on the properties of water, which is why it's a popular scale around the world.
And what about Fahrenheit? Why do we use that? It seems so confusing compared to Celsius.
That's a great observation. The Fahrenheit scale was created by a German physicist named Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit in the early 1700s. He wanted a way to measure temperatures more precisely for everyday life, so he used three key reference points: the freezing point of a saltwater solution, the freezing point of water, and the human body temperature.
Why did he use salt water? Isn't regular water good enough?
That's a good question. Salt water freezes at a lower temperature than pure water. By using it, Fahrenheit could extend the range of his temperature scale. So, on the Fahrenheit scale, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a bit different from the Celsius system.
Okay, but what about body temperature? How does that fit in?
That's actually an important part of the Fahrenheit system. Fahrenheit decided to set normal human body temperature at around 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Later, with more precise measurements, they adjusted it to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So, when you hear someone say they have a fever, like 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that means their body temperature is a little higher than normal. It's a really practical way to use the Fahrenheit scale in medicine.
So, normal body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius in Celsius, right?
That's correct. Body temperature in Celsius is around 37 degrees Celsius, and in Fahrenheit, it's 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's why when you get your temperature taken at the doctor's office, they're checking if you're close to those numbers.
Oh, I get it now. But how do you switch between Celsius and Fahrenheit? Is there an easy way to convert them?
There are formulas, but let me give you a simpler way to think about it. To go from Fahrenheit to Celsius, subtract 30 from the Fahrenheit number and then divide by 2. It's not perfectly accurate, but it's close enough for most things. For example, if it's 68 degrees Fahrenheit, you subtract 30, which gives you 38, and then divide by 2 to get about 19 degrees Celsius. The actual number is closer to 20 degrees Celsius, but this trick helps when you're just trying to estimate.
Oh, that's much easier than the complicated formulas. And to go from Celsius to Fahrenheit?
You can reverse the trick. Multiply the Celsius number by 2 and then add 30. So, let's say it's 20 degrees Celsius. Multiply 20 by 2 to get 40, then add 30 to get 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's close enough to give you a rough idea.
Wow, that makes so much more sense now. But why didn't everyone just agree on one system? Wouldn't that be easier?
You'd think so. But different countries developed their own systems, and it's hard to change once people get used to something. The US stuck with Fahrenheit while most of the world switched to Celsius because Celsius is easier for scientific calculations.
So Fahrenheit is mostly used here in the US?
That's right. Fahrenheit is still used in the US for things like weather forecasts and cooking. If you're baking something at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, that's about 175 degrees Celsius.
Oh, that's interesting. So if it's 32 degrees Fahrenheit outside, that's freezing, right? But in Celsius, that would be 0 degrees Celsius?
Exactly. That's the freezing point for water in both systems, just with different numbers. And if it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that would be a really hot day. That's about 38 degrees Celsius.
So if it's 75 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 24 degrees Celsius. I'm starting to get the hang of this.
You're doing great. It's all about getting used to the numbers. Once you know the key points, like freezing, boiling, and body temperature, you can figure out the rest pretty easily.
And I bet apps can do the math for me if I forget.
Absolutely. Most people use apps or digital thermometers to convert between the two, but it's good to understand how it works, just in case.
Yeah, I feel like I know so much more now. I can't wait to tell my friends about the body temperature thing. I bet they don't know it's different in Fahrenheit.
They probably don't, and it's a neat piece of trivia. Understanding these two systems will come in handy, especially if you ever travel to countries that use Celsius. Plus, it's good to know for things like weather and cooking.
I definitely want to travel someday. Maybe I'll visit Europe and see how they use Celsius all the time.
That's a great goal. And by then, you'll be a pro at converting between the two.
Thanks, Dad. Now I can impress my friends by explaining all this stuff. I think they're going to be really surprised when I tell them about body temperature.
I'm sure they will. You'll sound like an expert. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll be teaching your friends just like I teach my students.
I'm not sure about teaching, but I'll definitely sound smart when we talk about the weather.
And that's what matters.
Hi there, I'm Lucy, your English teacher. Today, we're going to dive into some cool words and phrases from the conversation you just watched between George and Mia about Celsius and Fahrenheit. It was all about how we measure temperature and why it can be confusing to use different scales like Fahrenheit and Celsius. Let's explore some of the key ideas and vocabulary from their chat. Now, let's start with a word George used when explaining why Fahrenheit can be tricky. He said, Fahrenheit can be confusing compared to Celsius. Confusing. Confusing. This word, confusing, means something that's hard to understand or makes you feel uncertain. For example, when you learn a new topic, it can feel confusing at first. Sometimes math can be confusing. Another example. It was confusing when I tried to read the map. We all get confused sometimes, and that's okay. New things can feel overwhelming, but the more you practice, the less confusing they become. Just think about learning to ride a bike. At first it was tricky, but after a while you got the hang of it. That's how it works with language too. Stick with it, and things that seem confusing now will get clearer and clearer. Next up, Mia mentioned the freezing point of water. She said, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but in Celsius, that would be 0 degrees Celsius. Freezing point. Freezing point. The freezing point is the temperature at which water turns into ice. In Celsius, water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, and in Fahrenheit, it freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's another example. It's below freezing point today, so wear your coat. Or, the freezing point of salt water is lower than regular water. It's interesting to think about how freezing works. In some places, it never gets cold enough to reach the freezing point, while in others, freezing temperatures are a regular part of winter. You might have noticed that different liquids freeze at different points, which is why salt is used to melt ice on roads. It lowers the freezing point and keeps the roads safer. Mia also learned about the boiling point. George explained, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius in Celsius and 212 degrees Fahrenheit in Fahrenheit. Boiling point. Boiling point. The boiling point is the temperature at which water turns into steam. It's 100 degrees Celsius in Celsius and 212 degrees Fahrenheit in Fahrenheit. Here's how it works. The water reached its boiling point, so it's ready to make tea. Or, the soup is boiling, which means it's at its boiling point. Boiling water is such a common thing, but do you know why it's important to understand the boiling point? Knowing when water boils is crucial for cooking, like making pasta or preparing soups. The boiling point also changes depending on where you are. At higher altitudes, like in the mountains, water boils at a lower temperature. Isn't that cool? Here's a fun phrase George used when explaining how to understand Fahrenheit better. He said, "You'll get the hang of converting temperatures with practice." Get the hang of. Get the hang of. Get the hang of means to learn or understand how to do something after some practice. You might not understand it right away, but after a few tries, you'll get the hang of it. For instance, It took me a while to get the hang of riding a bike. Or, after practicing, she got the hang of speaking English more confidently. This is such a useful phrase. You can use it in many situations when you're learning something new. The great thing about getting the hang of something is that it means you're improving. Think about the last time you got the hang of a new hobby or skill. Wasn't it a good feeling when things started to click? The same goes for learning new words or phrases in English. Another phrase George used is really interesting. He said, "The US decided to stick with Fahrenheit." Stick with. Stick with. To stick with something means to keep doing it or using it, even when you could change. For example, "I think I'll stick with this book, even though it's long." Or, "She decided to stick with her favorite hobby, painting." This phrase comes in handy when you're talking about choices and decisions. We often stick with things we're comfortable with, like favorite foods or hobbies. Even when there's a chance to try something new, sometimes it feels right to stick with what we know. It's all about staying with something that works for you, just like the US sticking with Fahrenheit. In the conversation, George talked about the importance of being precise. He said, "Fahrenheit was designed to be more precise for daily use." Precise. Precise. The word precise means exact or very accurate. When something is precise, it's clear and leaves no room for guessing. For example, "The instructions were very precise, so we followed them exactly." Or, "You need to be precise when measuring ingredients for a cake." Being precise is important in so many areas, like cooking, science, and even language. When you're precise, it helps others understand you clearly. Imagine a pilot who isn't precise with directions, or a doctor who isn't precise with measurements. Things could go wrong. So, learning to be precise in your communication is a great skill to have. When George and Mia were talking, Mia was very curious about how Celsius and Fahrenheit work. She asked, "And what about Fahrenheit? Why do we use that?" Curious. Curious. Curious means wanting to know more or being interested in learning something. Curiosity is great because it helps you ask questions and explore new ideas. For example, "She was curious about how airplanes fly." Or, "I'm curious to learn more about different cultures." Being curious is one of the best ways to learn. When you're curious, you open yourself up to new experiences and knowledge. Think about all the things you've learned just because you asked questions. The more curious you are, the more you'll discover about the world around you. So never stop being curious. It's one of the best qualities to have as a learner. George also talked about equations when converting temperatures. He said, "You can convert Celsius to Fahrenheit using a simple formula." Equation. Equation. An equation is a mathematical formula that helps solve a problem. In the context of temperature, an equation can help you convert Celsius to Fahrenheit or vice versa. Here's an example. The math equation helped us find the answer quickly. Or, we used an equation to calculate the area of the room. Equations are super helpful in everyday life. From measuring the ingredients in a recipe to figuring out how much paint you need for a wall, equations can solve all kinds of problems. And don't worry, you don't need to be a math genius to use them. Once you understand how they work, equations become simple tools that help you get accurate results. Mia learned about different temperature scales in the conversation. George explained, "The Celsius scale is used in most countries." Scale. Scale. A scale is a system for measuring or comparing things. In this case, the Celsius scale measures temperature in degrees, but we use scales to measure lots of things. For instance, the Richter scale measures the strength of earthquakes. Or, the scale showed the temperature was rising quickly. Scales are important in many areas of life. We use them to measure weight, height, temperature, and even time. Without scales, it would be hard to compare things or keep track of measurements. You'll see different scales being used for different purposes, but they all help us understand the world more clearly. So, next time you hear about a scale, think about what it's measuring. Finally, George used the word roughly when talking about estimating temperatures. He said, It's roughly 20 degrees Celsius today. Roughly. Roughly. Roughly means approximately or not exactly, but close enough. We use it when we don't need to be super precise. For example, there were roughly 50 people at the event. Or, the trip will take roughly 2 hours by car. We use roughly all the time in our daily conversations. When you don't need to give an exact number or answer, it's helpful to say something like roughly. It gives you some flexibility while still giving enough information. So, if someone asks you what time the party starts and you're not sure, you can say roughly 6 p.m. It's a useful way to sound casual, but clear. So, today we learned some cool words and phrases like confusing, boiling point, curious, and get the hang of. These are all useful in helping you talk about everyday situations, whether it's about the weather, learning something new, or just being curious. If you have any questions or want to practice more, feel free to leave a comment, and we can discuss it further. I had fun teaching today, and I hope you enjoyed it too.